My name is Morrison Caldwell, and 3 months ago, I was sleeping on a tarp on a concrete floor inside a warehouse that my own wife told me to go live in. Not because we were poor, not because we had nowhere else to go, because she was done with me, done with what I represented, done with the version of herself she saw when she stood next to me at dinner parties and watched her husband quietly fold his hands while his brother took the room. She opened the front door, looked at me the way you look at a piece of furniture you've finally decided to donate, and said, "If that warehouse means so much to you, go stay there tonight." And I did. What I found inside that warehouse in the next 72 hours changed everything. Not in the way motivational stories tell you things change. Not with a speech. Not with a comeback moment where I walked back into a room and everyone applauded. It changed the way a calculation changes. Quietly. Irreversibly. On paper. In clauses. In language that my brother Jason had held in his hands and never once read. Before I tell you what I found, I need you to understand something about the kind of man I was before that night. Because if you've ever been the steady one, the responsible one, the one everyone calls when things fall apart and ignores when things go right, then you already know exactly who Morrison Caldwell is. You've been him. You might be him right now. And what happened to me is either a warning or a blueprint, depending on how carefully you're paying attention. Here's what you need to know before we go any further. My father left me a 14,000 square foot industrial warehouse near the Long Beach Port District. Rusted siding. Cracked asphalt. Smelled like oil, salt, and 30 years of neglect. My brother Jason received a Malibu beachfront property worth several $1,000,000. And when the will was read, Jason leaned back in his chair at the attorney's office, sunglasses resting on his head like he'd just stepped off a yacht, and said, "Dad knew you like structure, Mike. Concrete, steel, something sturdy." He said it the way people say things when they want the room to know they won without having to announce it directly. 3 months later, I would be sitting inside that condemned warehouse holding a federal contract worth nearly $4 million that my brother had just accidentally signed over to me because he never bothered to read the document he handed me. This is not a story about luck. This is a story about what happens when a man who reads every attachment, audits every clause, and checks every footnote finally stops cleaning up other people's messes and starts reading his own. Stay with me, because the details matter here. Every single one of them. Underscore. Let me take you back to the beginning because this story doesn't start in the warehouse. It starts at a dinner table in Malibu, with crystal glasses and investors in pressed shirts, and my wife adjusting her wine glass, while my brother made the room laugh at my expense. I am 52 years old. For 30 years, I worked in supply chain compliance and financial auditing. I have flown into Texas distribution centers at 2 in the morning to trace inventory leakage. I have sat in front of federal compliance boards in Michigan in January and testified about procurement irregularities that cost companies 8 figures to ignore. I know how to build a case. I know how to follow a paper trail. I know how to sit completely still while someone in a better suit underestimates me. What I did not know, until very recently, was how to do any of that for myself. My brother Jason Turner is 3 years younger than me and has always operated on a principle that I spent decades trying to respect and eventually had to recognize as recklessness dressed in confidence. Jason doesn't read documents. Jason hires people to read documents and then doesn't listen to them either. Jason believes that momentum is a substitute for accuracy and that if you move fast enough, the details never catch you. For most of his life, he was right, or close enough to right that the difference didn't show. He had built a reputation in Southern California real estate as a deal maker. Not a builder, not an analyst, a deal maker. The kind of man who walks into a room and makes everyone feel like the numbers are already worked out when they aren't. The kind of man who refinances before the first loan is paid. The kind of man who my wife, Lauren, looked at across every dinner table we ever shared with him and described afterward with a single word. Vision. Lauren had been using that word for 15 years. Jason has vision. Jason sees the big picture. Jason takes risks. And every time she said it, the implication was the same. You don't. You're the one who checks the invoices. You're the paperwork guy. You're the structure, not the architecture. I had accepted that for a long time. Longer than I should have. Our father, Richard Caldwell, was not a complicated man. He worked 40 years as a machinist at a Long Beach shipyard. He did not believe in stocks or speculation or coastal investment syndicates. He believed in land, in physical things you could walk on and pass down. He was quiet in the way that men of his generation were quiet, not because they had nothing to say, but because they believed that what you built said more than what you announced. When he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, it moved the way that disease moves. Quickly, without negotiation. He was gone in 6 weeks, and none of us had finished processing the diagnosis before we were sitting in an attorney's office reading the terms of what he'd left behind. Jason received the Malibu beach house, a property Dad had bought in the 80s when the coastline was still within reach of a machinist's savings. It had appreciated into something extraordinary. Ocean view, glass railings that Jason had already installed before Dad was in the ground. An address that made investors lean forward when you mentioned it. I received the warehouse. 14,000 square feet of industrial space near the Old Port District. A property that the estate attorney had classified as requiring substantial remediation. A property that Jason had already described to everyone who would listen as scrapland. A property that my wife would eventually tell me to go sleep in. And a property that, beneath 14 inches of concrete and 30 years of silence, was running a live federal infrastructure node worth more money than Jason had made in the last decade combined. But I didn't know that yet. And before I knew it, I had to get through the dinner. Underscore. The dinner at Jason's Malibu house happened 6 weeks after Dad died. Jason had already refinanced the property, installed the glass railings I mentioned, hired a media consultant, and assembled a group of investors for what he was calling Turner Coastal Ventures, a real estate syndication he had structured around the beach house as the flagship asset. He was moving fast. Jason always moved fast. Speed was the strategy. Lauren wore a cream dress and her good earrings. She had been looking forward to this dinner in a way that I recognized as the look she got when she was hoping I would somehow be different in this environment. More present, more vocal, more like Jason. I wore what I always wore. Arrived when I said I would. Sat where I was placed. The investors were the kind of men who wore watches as a communication strategy. They asked questions they already knew the answers to and nodded at responses whether or not they were accurate. One of them, a man named Prescott who had made his money in commercial development and now moved it around in syndicates like chess pieces, asked Jason about the industrial property he had seen listed in the probate filings. Jason didn't miss a beat. Oh, that thing. Basically scrap land. Michael took it. He's always been good at warehouses. Soft laughter. The polite kind that costs nothing and signals everything. Prescott glanced at me with the kind of look you give a footnote. Lauren adjusted her wine glass. Then she said it. He'll probably turn it into a spreadsheet. More laughter. Someone tapped a fork against a plate. I felt the heat move up the back of my neck. I have sat in rooms with federal investigators. I have presented findings to boards of directors who did not want to hear what I was presenting. I know how to control my face when my body wants to react. But there is a specific temperature to humiliation that only exists inside your own marriage. Inside a room where the person who is supposed to be on your side decides in that moment that being on your side costs too much. I said nothing. I folded my hands. I listened. After the investors left, the ocean wind pressed against the glass walls and Lauren stood at the kitchen island with her arms crossed. Not angry. Decided. There's a difference. You didn't say much tonight, she said. I wasn't asked much. Jason is trying to build something. You could at least act supportive. I've paid property taxes on that warehouse for 5 years while Jason refinanced the beach house twice. That's different. How? Because Jason has vision. And there it was. The word again. I let it sit for a moment before I responded. And what do I have? She hesitated. And in that hesitation, I understood that what she was about to say had been rehearsed, at least internally. She had been thinking about how to say this for a long time. Stability, she said. But stability doesn't grow. I looked at her face. I had known this woman for 16 years. I could read her the way I read contracts. And what I read in that moment was not cruelty. It was something more painful than cruelty. It was disappointment that had curdled into conclusion. She had made up her mind. About me. About what I was capable of. about whether the version of the future that included me was the version she wanted. I protect us, I said. From what? Progress. From the kind of decisions that end in foreclosure. She shook her head. You're 52 years old, Michael. Your biggest asset is a condemned warehouse. It landed heavier than I expected. Not because it was mean. Because it was delivered with the calm of a person reading aloud from a document they'd already reviewed and accepted. Like the conclusion had already been filed. I kept us out of debt, I said quietly. You kept us small. The ocean wind again. The silence between us that had been building for years finally had a shape. She walked to the front door, opened it, and without dramatics, without a scene, without anything that could be called a fight, she said, maybe you should figure out who you are without leaning on Jason's shadow. I stepped outside. She said, if that warehouse means so much to you, go stay there tonight. The lock clicked. Clean. Final. I stood on the walkway for a full minute. Through the glass wall, I could see Jason laughing at something on his phone. Inside the house where my wife no longer wanted me to be, everything was lit and warm and continuing without interruption. I checked my pockets. Wallet, phone, keys. The warehouse key was on my ring. It had been there for 5 years, never used, kept out of habit or principle or something I couldn't have named until that moment. I drove 28 miles to Long Beach in complete silence. Underscore. The industrial district was asleep when I arrived. The street lights over the port corridor flickered against cracked pavement. The port cranes stood against the night sky like the skeletons of something enormous. The gate to the warehouse creaked when I unlocked it. The rolling steel door groaned upward with resistance, the way things groan when they haven't been asked to move in a long time. Inside it smelled like oil and salt air and old dust. The smell of time standing still. I stepped in. Concrete floor, cool under my shoes. Metal trusses overhead. Empty space stretching into shadow. No ocean view. No investors. No crystal glasses. No laughter at my expense. I let the rolling door fall shut behind me. The echo lingered. And something happened that I didn't expect. My breathing slowed. Not from defeat. From something else entirely. Something I couldn't immediately name. I walked to the center of the floor and looked up at the trusses and understood, without quite being able to articulate it yet, that this was the first room in a very long time where no one was performing anything, including me. And then I saw it. A thick envelope taped to the inside of the breaker panel. I almost walked past it. But I am a man who has audited supply chains in places where people told me there was nothing to find. I don't walk past things taped to the inside of panels. Property tax notice. Stamped 2 days earlier. I unfolded it slowly and read it by the pale glow of my phone flashlight. Standard municipal language at the top, parcel number, assessed value, overdue balance. And then, in the classification line, in bold municipal print, a phrase that stopped me completely. Industrial multi-use. Subsurface easement active. Subsurface easement active. I stood there for a long moment. In supply chain auditing, vague language hides leverage. You do not label something active unless something is flowing through it. You don't file a subsurface easement in municipal records and mark it active on a tax notice unless something beneath that floor is either physically operational or financially live. Probably both. I folded the notice carefully and slipped it into my jacket pocket. The air inside the warehouse felt different than it had 30 seconds earlier. Not warmer, not colder, just unfinished. Like a sentence that had a word missing, and I had just found where it went. I dragged a tarp from the corner of the warehouse, laid it flat on the concrete floor, and used my folded jacket as a pillow. I lay on my back and stared up into the dark rafters and felt, for the first time that entire night, not humiliated, not defeated, not the man who got locked out of his brother's success story and his own marriage in the same evening. I felt like an auditor who had just found the first anomaly. Jason had never come here. Not once in 5 years since Dad died. He had driven past, filed the address with his attorney, described it to investors as scrap land, and moved on. He had never opened the breaker panel. He had never read the municipal filings. He had never walked to the center of the floor and looked up. He saw rust. I saw language. And language is where ownership lives. I closed my eyes. Somewhere between the word condemned and the word easement, something didn't add up. and I had built my entire life on noticing what doesn't add up. Underscore. I woke before sunrise. The warehouse was already warming. Even before 6 in the morning, the metal siding beginning to tick as it absorbed the early heat. Light leaked through the high, grimy windows in long geometric strips across the concrete floor. For a moment, I lay completely still and listened the way you listen in a building when you want to know whether it's sound. Warehouses have their own language. Pipes contract. Roof panels shift with thermal change. Wind finds the gaps in corrugated siding and hums through them in a specific register. If you stay still long enough, the structure tells you its condition, whether it's decaying or just dormant. This one was dormant, not dying, not condemned in any true structural sense. Neglected, certainly. Unvisited. But the bones were intact. And a building with intact bones and active municipal language taped to its breaker panel was not a condemned warehouse. It was a misclassified asset. Those are two very different things, and the difference between them is exactly the kind of gap that people like me spend careers measuring. I got up, walked back to the breaker panel, and opened it again. The breakers were labeled in faded marker. Lighting. Dock power. West office. Zone C port feed. Zone C had a small red dot next to it. Not factory labeled. Hand-marked. Someone had marked it deliberately, which meant someone had been here, had reviewed this panel, had understood the system well enough to identify Zone C as something separate. Something worth noting. I pressed my palm against the metal casing around Zone C. Warm. Not hot. Not malfunctioning. But warm in the way that things are warm when something is running beneath them. At 6 in the morning, in a building with no active tenants, no equipment, no running systems, that warmth should not have been there. I picked up my phone and pulled the county records database. The loading icon spun for longer than I liked. Then the deed surfaced, and there was an attachment I had never seen before. An attachment that, had I been Jason, I would have handed to someone else to review and then forgotten about entirely. Right-of-way granted to Pacific Coastal Infrastructure Group for fiber routing and secure utility conduit. Filed 1998. The year Dad expanded the warehouse. The year he stopped talking about selling it. Fiber routing. Secure utility conduit. Not storage. Not industrial plumbing. Data infrastructure. I sat back against a stack of old shipping pallets and let that sit for a moment. My father had been a machinist. A practical man who believed in land. Who bought property before it appreciated and held it long after others would have sold. Who never explained his decisions, but always had a reason for them. Who had, in 1998, granted a right-of-way to a federal infrastructure contractor for what anyone looking at the surface of that warehouse would have dismissed as buried pipe. Dad hadn't sold it. He hadn't converted it. He hadn't mentioned it. Not to me, not to Jason, not to Lauren, not to anyone I was aware of. He had simply kept it. Maintained the property taxes. Kept the key on a hook in his garage. And died without explaining why. I called the utility company listed on the breaker panel. A woman named Denise answered after 4 minutes of elevator, hold music. City Grid Services, how can I help you? I'm reviewing usage on an industrial parcel in Long Beach. Parcel 48B. She typed for a moment, then stopped. Sir, that meter isn't on city distribution. It isn't. No, that building is fed through a private industrial substation. It's a legacy connection, tied to Port Authority infrastructure. You'd need to contact Pacific Coastal for billing. Does it bill monthly? Yes, through the current title holder. Has it been active? Pause. Yes, sir. Continuous draw. Continuous as in 24 hours? Yes, sir. Has anyone disputed it? No, sir. I thanked her and sat very still. Continuous draw. Not fluctuating. Not cyclical. Constant. A perfectly flat consumption line in a building that was supposed to be empty. Data doesn't lie. Something beneath this building was running around the clock, climate-controlled, stable, invisible from the surface, and had been for years. I was still sitting with that thought when the black SUV pulled up outside. Underscore. I didn't need to look out the window to know who it was. Jason had a specific rhythm to his arrivals. Fast, but deliberate. The way he drove was the way he moved through everything. Quick enough to look decisive. Not slow enough to be careful. He didn't knock. Jason never knocked. The rolling door groaned upward, and sunlight cut into the interior. He stepped inside wearing sunglasses and a linen button-down shirt, looking like he had come directly from the marina. He wiped the immediate sweat from his forehead and looked around the warehouse with the expression of a man who has walked into a place solely to confirm it is as worthless as he remembered. "What are you doing, Morrison?" He used the nickname he'd been using for me since childhood, the one that sat between affectionate and dismissive depending on which side of a deal he was on. "It smells like a shipyard funeral in here." "I slept," I said. "You're serious." He pulled his sunglasses off and hooked them on his collar. "Lauren called me. Said you stormed off." "I didn't storm. Look, I don't care about the domestic drama." He reached into the breast pocket of his linen shirt and tossed an envelope at me. "What I care about is this." I opened it. Utility account notice. Delinquent balance. Amount due, $8,742.19. $8,000? I said. "It's been accruing. You're the one in possession of this property now. Transfer the account into your name. I'm not carrying dead weight on a utility line that services a building I have no interest in. I've used zero electricity in this building. Not my problem." I looked at him for a moment. "Have you ever checked the meter?" I asked. He laughed. The specific laugh of someone who finds a question so obviously beneath consideration that the laugh itself is the answer. "It's a warehouse, Morrison, not Fort Knox. Have you ever reviewed the deed attachments?" He rolled his eyes. "I hire people for that." "Did they read them?" "What is your obsession with paperwork?" He stepped closer. "You think Dad left some buried treasure and the boring brother gets to find it? Is that the fantasy?" I didn't answer. He misread my silence as surrender. He always had. "Look," he said, lowering his voice to the register he used when he wanted to appear magnanimous. "I have a buyer lined up for this land. Mixed-use developer. They'll clear the structure, build lofts, the whole deal. I need clean title. No delinquent utility accounts, nothing that complicates inspection. You transfer what I asked. We close in 3 weeks. Everyone moves on. Have you disclosed the subsurface rights?" I asked. He blinked. "What rights?" "The easements. The infrastructure. The 1998 filing. Junk pipe under dirt." "Relax." I walked to the breaker panel and opened it. "Come here," I said. He walked over slowly, humoring me the way someone humors a child who wants to show them something in the dirt. "Put your hand on that casing," I said. He pressed his palm against the metal around Zone C. A pause. "It's warm," he said. "Nothing inside the building is running." He pulled his hand back. Not sharply. Carefully. The way you pull your hand back when you've touched something that rearranges a small assumption you didn't know you were carrying. "You're overthinking this," he said. But the edge was gone from his voice. "I'm reading it." For a moment, I lay completely still and listened the way you listen in a building when you want to know whether it's sound. Warehouses have their own language. Pipes contract. Roof panels shift with thermal change. Wind finds the gaps in corrugated siding and hums through them in a specific register. If you stay still long enough, the structure tells you its condition, whether it's decaying or just dormant. This one was dormant. Not dying. Not condemned in any true structural sense. Neglected, certainly. Unvisited. But the bones were intact. And a building with intact bones and active municipal language taped to its breaker panel was not a condemned warehouse. It was a misclassified asset. Those are two very different things, and the difference between them is exactly the kind of gap that people like me spend careers measuring. I got up, walked back to the breaker panel, and opened it again. The breakers were labeled in faded marker. Lighting. Dock power. West office. Zone C port feed. Zone C had a small red dot next to it. Not factory labeled. Hand-marked. Someone had marked it deliberately, which meant someone had been here, had reviewed this panel, had understood the system well enough to identify Zone C as something separate. Something worth noting. I pressed my palm against the metal casing around Zone C. Warm. Not hot. Not malfunctioning. But warm in the way that things are warm when something is running beneath them. At 6 in the morning, in a building with no active tenants, no equipment, no running systems, that warmth should not have been there. I picked up my phone and pulled the county records database. The loading icon spun for longer than I liked. Then the deed surfaced. And there was an attachment I had never seen before. An attachment that, had I been Jason, I would have handed to someone else to review and then forgotten about entirely. Right-of-way granted to Pacific Coastal Infrastructure Group for fiber routing and secure utility conduit. Filed 1998. The year Dad expanded the warehouse. The year he stopped talking about selling it. Fiber routing. Secure utility conduit. Not storage. Not industrial plumbing. Data infrastructure. I sat back against a stack of old shipping pallets and let that sit for a moment. My father had been a machinist. A practical man who believed in land. Who bought property before it appreciated and held it long after others would have sold. Who never explained his decisions, but always had a reason for them. Who had, in 1998, granted a right-of-way to a federal infrastructure contractor for what anyone looking at the surface of that warehouse would have dismissed as buried pipe. Dad hadn't sold it. He hadn't converted it. He hadn't mentioned it. Not to me, not to Jason, not to Lauren, not to anyone I was aware of. He had simply kept it, maintained the property taxes, kept the key on a hook in his garage, and died without explaining why. I called the utility company listed on the breaker panel. A woman named Denise answered after 4 minutes of elevator hold music. City Grid Services, how can I help you? I'm reviewing usage on an industrial parcel in Long Beach. Parcel 48B. She typed for a moment, then stopped. Sir, that meter isn't on city distribution. It isn't. No. That building is fed through a private industrial substation. It's a legacy connection tied to Port Authority infrastructure. You'd need to contact Pacific Coastal for billing. Does it bill monthly? Yes, through the current title holder. Has it been active? Pause. Yes, sir. Continuous draw. Continuous as in 24 hours? Yes, sir. Has anyone disputed it? No, sir. I thanked her and sat very still. Continuous draw. Not fluctuating. Not cyclical. Constant. A perfectly flat consumption line in a building that was supposed to be empty. Data doesn't lie. Something beneath this building was running around the clock, climate-controlled, stable, invisible from the surface, and had been for years. I was still sitting with that thought when the black SUV pulled up outside. Underscore. I didn't need to look out the window to know who it was. Jason had a specific rhythm to his arrivals. Fast, but deliberate. The way he drove was the way he moved through everything. Quick enough to look decisive. Not slow enough to be careful. He didn't knock. Jason never knocked. The rolling door groaned upward, and sunlight cut into the interior. He stepped inside wearing sunglasses and a linen button-down shirt, looking like he had come directly from the marina. He wiped the immediate sweat from his forehead and looked around the warehouse with the expression of a man who has walked into a place solely to confirm it is as worthless as he remembered. What are you doing, Morrison? He used the nickname he'd been using for me since childhood, the one that sat between affectionate and dismissive depending on which side of a deal he was on. It smells like a shipyard funeral in here. I slept, I said. You're serious. He pulled his sunglasses off and hooked them on his collar. Lauren called me. Said you stormed off. I didn't storm. Look, I don't care about the domestic drama. He reached into the breast pocket of his linen shirt and tossed an envelope at me. What I care about is this. I opened it. Utility account notice. Delinquent balance. Amount due. $8,742.19. $8,000? I said, it's been accruing. You're the one in possession of this property now. Transfer the account into your name. I'm not carrying dead weight on a utility line that services a building I have no interest in. I've used zero electricity in this building. Not my problem. I looked at him for a moment. Have you ever checked the meter? I asked. He laughed. The specific laugh of someone who finds a question so obviously beneath consideration that the laugh itself is the answer. It's a warehouse, Morrison, not Fort Knox. Have you ever reviewed the deed attachments? He rolled his eyes. I hire people for that. Did they read them? What is your obsession with paperwork? He stepped closer. You think Dad left some buried treasure and the boring brother gets to find it? Is that the fantasy? I didn't answer. He misread my silence as surrender. He always had. Look, he said, lowering his voice to the register he used when he wanted to appear magnanimous. I have a buyer lined up for this land. Mixed-use developer. They'll clear the structure build lofts, the whole deal. I need clean title. No delinquent utility accounts, nothing that complicates inspection. You transfer what I asked. We close in 3 weeks. Everyone moves on. Have you disclosed the subsurface rights? I asked. He blinked. What rights? The easements. The infrastructure. The 1998 filing. Junk pipe under dirt. Relax. I walked to the breaker panel and opened it. Come here, I said. He walked over slowly, humoring me the way someone humors a child who wants to show them something in the dirt. Put your hand on that casing, I said. He pressed his palm against the metal around Zone C. A pause. It's warm, he said. Nothing inside the building is running. He pulled his hand back. Not sharply. Carefully. The way you pull your hand back when you've touched something that rearranges a small assumption you didn't know you were carrying. You're overthinking this, he said. But the edge was gone from his voice. I'm reading it. The steel access plate was in the west wall of the warehouse floor, flush with the concrete, painted over in the same gray as everything around it. Almost invisible. Almost. You had to know what to look for, and I had been looking since I found the municipal notice. For recessed bolts. When I crouched down and brushed the dust away, the faint stamp was still legible. PCIG. Authorized personnel only. I looked at those words for a long moment. Then I took out my phone and called Pacific Coastal Infrastructure Group. A man named Harold Ondwan answered on the third ring. His voice had the measured quality of someone who has been navigating careful conversations for a long time. I'm calling regarding Parcel 48B, I said. A pause. The specific pause of someone who was not expecting this call, but had been prepared for it. Yes, he said evenly. I'm the current rights holder, I said. Another pause. Longer. We were under the impression that ownership was unsettled, he said carefully. It was. Now it isn't. He cleared his throat. We have been attempting to route lease payments for several years. I'm aware. I've reviewed the escrow documentation. A subtle shift in his tone. The shift that happens when someone on the other end of a call understands they are speaking with someone who has actually read the relevant documents. Are you interested in maintaining the existing agreement? He asked. Or in discussing a buyout? Discussing, I said. Good, he said. And in that single word was something I hadn't heard directed at me in a very long time from anyone with any kind of authority or resources. Respect. Not the deference you receive when people are indulging you. Not the politeness of someone waiting for you to finish so they can explain why you're wrong. The respect of someone who has recognized they are speaking to the controlling party and is adjusting accordingly. When I hung up, the warehouse felt different than it had every other time I had stood inside it. Not empty. Active. Not condemned. Operational. Not a punishment. A platform. Underscore, Harold Ondwan and his team arrived 5 days later. 2 of them in pressed shirts, a compliance officer named Marisol Vega, and the quiet efficiency that comes from people who operate inside federal protocols. They arrived without drama, reviewed the notarized transfer documentation carefully, confirmed the chain of title, and descended into the access chamber beneath the steel plate. I stayed above and listened. 40 minutes later, they came back up. Harold stood in the center of the warehouse floor and looked at me directly. Mr. Caldwell, he said, we have been holding 5 years of escrowed lease payments pending confirmation of rightful beneficiary. I waited. The total, including applicable escalators and accumulated interest on delayed routing compensation, he said, is $2,432,000. $2,432,000. It did not hit me the way a lottery number hits you. It did not produce the disorientation of sudden wealth. It landed the way a correctly balanced audit lands. Like a number that was always supposed to be there, finally placed in the correct column. And the buyout. I said. Marisol stepped forward. Based on current infrastructure replacement cost, redundancy value, and remaining contract term, our proposed buyout for full subsurface rights transfer would be $3.8 million. I looked at her. I looked at Harold. Jason was selling the surface of this land for $450,000. He had signed over rights worth nearly 9 times that. Without reading. Without asking. Without pausing long enough to notice the warmth radiating from the breaker panel casing. I'll consider the buyout, I said calmly. Harold nodded. Until then, Lease payments will resume quarterly to your designated account. After they left, I stood alone in the warehouse for a long time. Sunlight came through the high windows in the same strips it always came through. The dust was the same dust. The smell of oil and salt and old concrete. Everything on the surface was exactly what it had always been. But beneath my feet, something expensive was flowing without interruption. Had been flowing for 25 years. Would keep flowing whether anyone in my family acknowledged it or not. Dad hadn't left me a burden. He hadn't left me a consolation prize. He hadn't left me the thing that was left over after the good thing was taken. He had left me a conduit. And he had structured it specifically so that it couldn't be dissolved, couldn't be rushed, couldn't be flipped before someone understood what it was. He had built it to outlast momentum. He had built it to reward patience. He had built it to be found by the son who would read the attachments. He knew which son that was. He always knew. Underscore. The closing was scheduled for Thursday morning. Harborview title. Glass building overlooking the marina. The kind of office designed to make transactions feel inevitable. Jason was already there when I arrived, leaning against the reception desk in the manner of a man who has pre-decided that this is going to go well. The developer, Carl Benson, was a compact man in his 50s with the precise handshake of someone who closes deals the way surgeons make incisions. Quick, clean, committed. Industrial conversions are very hot right now, Carl said to me as we shook hands. You brothers are sitting on something solid here. Jason laughed. Not this one. This is more of a clearance sale. We moved into the conference room. Documents were laid out in careful stacks. I sat across from Jason. Carl sat at the head of the table. His attorney, a woman named Patricia Lemos who had the eyes of someone who had read enough closing documents to have developed opinions about human nature, began reviewing the disclosure stack. She stopped. Subsurface infrastructure, she said, reading from a page in the stack. Jason waved his hand. Obsolete fiber lines. Nothing active. Patricia looked at me. Not at Jason. At me. Active, she said. Lease is active, I said evenly. Payments current. Federal contract, ongoing. Jason turned toward me. The shift in his body was immediate and physical, the way a building shifts when the foundation has been challenged. What are you talking about? Patricia set her pen down. Mr. Turner, if this parcel carries an active subsurface federal lease, this property cannot be transferred free and clear without explicit disclosure, consent of the subterranean rights holder, and formal assignment or buyout. This closing cannot proceed under the current representations. Jason's face lost color in layers. First the confidence went, then the calculation. Then, underneath it all, something more vulnerable and more accurate to who he actually was. A man who had believed for a very long time that speed was the same as intelligence, and who was now understanding, in real time, in front of a developer and two attorneys and his older brother, that it was not. That's ridiculous, he said. His voice had changed registers. It's buried conduit from the 90s. It's nothing. I slid a folder across the table. Inside, the notarized transfer document Jason had signed. The PCIG lease confirmation. The escrow release statement showing $2.4 million in held payments. The federal compliance acknowledgement from Marisol Vega's office. Patricia read. Carl read. Jason stared at the folder. The room was quiet. Not uncomfortable quiet. Clarifying quiet. The kind of quiet that happens when the paperwork has already said everything that needs to be said and the people in the room are simply catching up to it. Jason, Carl said. He said it carefully, the way you say a name when you are about to say something that can't be unsaid. You represented this parcel as unencumbered. It is unencumbered, Jason said. The fiber lines are junk. The executed document, Patricia said, without looking up from the folder, transfers subsurface structural rights. Unless expressly reserved by the seller, those rights are included in this transfer. She looked up. They were not reserved. Jason's head turned toward me slowly. You knew, he said. It wasn't a question. I read the attachments, I said. You knew, and you let me draft that document. You asked me to sign a transfer. I signed what was offered. You let me think it was nothing. I held his gaze. You told me it was nothing. I never agreed. Carl stood, quietly, without drama. We'll need to reassess this transaction entirely, he said. Patricia will be in touch. He shook my hand. He did not shake Jason's. He and Patricia gathered their documents and left. Jason and I sat alone in the conference room. Through the glass wall, the marina stretched out in the morning sunlight, boats moving slowly across the water as if nothing significant had happened. But something significant had happened. For the first time in 52 years of being the quiet one, the steady one, the one who fixed what others broke and got nothing for it, I had sat completely still while someone else moved recklessly, and the stillness had won. Underscore. Jason didn't speak for a long time. When he did, his voice had a quality I had never heard from him before. Not anger, not calculation, something closer to vertigo. You set me up, he said. I asked you to include subsurface rights in the transfer document, I said. You agreed. You drafted it. You signed it. You knew I didn't understand what I was signing. I gave you every opportunity to ask. He leaned forward. 450,000. I had that lined up. That would have cleared my bridge loan. There it was. The thing underneath the performance. Jason had refinanced the beach house to fund his syndication venture. He had structured the warehouse sale as a bridge payment for the debt he had already created. He had been moving fast because he was already in motion and couldn't afford to stop. Speed hadn't been a strategy. It had been a symptom. I can fix this, he said, switching registers the way he always switched registers when one approach stopped working. We can renegotiate. Split the subsurface buyout. 50-50. It's not 50-50 anymore, I said. What does that mean? You transferred subsurface structural rights to me? I said. In a document you wrote. With a notary present. At your suggestion. He stood up and walked to the window. He looked out at the marina for a moment. You were supposed to clean this up, he said quietly. Not angry anymore. Almost hollow. That was always the deal. You clean it up, I moved forward. I know, I said. That's what it was. He turned around. And now? I stood up and collected my folder. Now it's different. He looked at me, and I recognized something in his face that I had not seen there before. Not respect exactly. Not yet. But the beginning of something more accurate than what had been there before, which was the comfortable assumption of a man who has never been surprised by his own mistakes. What are you going to do with it, he asked. Read it carefully, I said, and then decide. I walked out through the lobby of Harborview Title and into the clean morning light and drove back to the warehouse. Underscore. That evening, Lauren came. She picked her way across the cracked asphalt in shoes that weren't designed for it, which was a kind of statement in itself. She stepped through the rolling door and stood at the edge of the concrete and looked around the way people look at a place when they are trying to reconcile what they expected with what they're seeing. She had expected something small, something defeated, a man sleeping on a tarp surrounded by rust and failure. What she found was a man who had been sitting in the right place at the right time reading the right documents. You're really staying here, she said. For now. She walked in slowly, looking up at the trusses, down at the concrete, around at the empty walls. It's not what I thought it was, she said quietly. No, I agreed. She stopped in front of me. Jason says you sabotaged the deal. Jason says a lot of things instead of reading documents. She almost smiled. Almost. There's talk of a lawsuit. There will be. It won't succeed. The subsurface rights. They're mine. She swallowed. How much? Enough. She looked at me for a long moment. The evening light through the high windows was warm and indirect, and it made the warehouse look almost amber, almost something you could call beautiful if you were willing to look at it long enough. I thought this place was worthless, she said. Most people only see what's on the surface. Her eyes moved across my face. I didn't mean what I said. About you being small. You meant it, I said gently. You just didn't have all the information yet. Tears came briefly to her eyes. Not dramatically. The way tears come when a realization is too specific and too personal to process any other way. I wanted momentum, she said. I offered stability. I thought they were opposites. They're not, I said. Stability is what momentum rests on. Take the foundation away and you don't get motion. You get collapse. She stood in the center of the warehouse floor and turned in a slow circle, Looking at the space the way you look at something when you're trying to see it for the first time after seeing it wrong for a long time. I don't know what happens next, she said. I do, I said quietly. She looked at me. Tell me. We read the documents, I said. Together. All of them. Before we decide anything. She nodded slowly. Not the nod of someone who is agreeing because they have no other option. The nod of someone who has just understood something for the first time and is letting it settle. Monday arrived with clean paperwork and a number I had already estimated but was still meaningful to see written out by a third party in formal terms. SIG's formal buyout offer. $3.8 million for complete subsurface rights transfer. Immediate upon execution. Federal compliance signed and cleared. After taxes, legal structuring, and the costs associated with confirming clean title on my end, I would clear just under $3 million. I sat with the document for a full 24 hours before I signed it. Not because I was uncertain, because I had spent a career watching people sign documents before they understood what they were signing, and I was not going to be that person. Not even when the numbers were in my favor. Not even when the pressure of the moment was pushing me toward a quick signature. I read every line, every clause, every defined term. I had Evelyn review it independently. I asked Harold 3 specific questions about the transition provisions and didn't accept the first answer to any of them. Then I signed. Not quickly, not emotionally. Precisely. The funds cleared 72 hours later. Underscore. Jason called the following week. I answered on the second ring. Developer backed out, he said. His voice had the specific flatness of someone who has been sitting with a bad outcome long enough to have finished being surprised by it and started being afraid of it. Claiming misrepresentation. I know. The bridge loan is due in 45 days. I know that too. Silence. I need time, he said. Just a little. 6 weeks. Maybe 8. Time is expensive, I said. You know that better than most. Another silence. Longer. Are you going to help me? He asked. He didn't ask it the way Jason usually asked things, with the undercurrent of someone who expects yes. He asked it like a man who genuinely doesn't know the answer and is afraid of it. I'm not your safety net anymore, I said quietly. He didn't argue. He didn't negotiate. He didn't reframe or pivot or offer a new deal. He simply said nothing for a long moment. And then he said, okay, and hung up. I sat in the warehouse and listened to the building settle in the afternoon heat. There was no victory in that call. No satisfaction in Jason's difficulty. The only thing I felt was something closer to grief. The specific grief of watching someone you've protected for 30 years finally have to meet the consequences of moving too fast through a world they never fully read. He would land somewhere. Jason always landed. But it would be softer, and the landing would belong to him in a way that it never had when I was underneath him catching the fall. Underscore. _ 3 weeks after the PCIG closing, I moved out of the warehouse and into a modest house inland. Not coastal. Not designed to impress anyone. Paid in full. 2 bedrooms, a study, a kitchen with good light, and enough counter space to spread documents across. I started a compliance consulting firm. Infrastructure audits. Municipal contract review. The kind of work that requires patience and precision and the willingness to read things that other people have decided aren't worth their time. I had 3 clients in the first month. 7 in the second. 2 of them came through referrals from contacts at the Port Authority who had quietly noted my interaction with PCIG and drawn conclusions about my usefulness. The warehouse still stands. I retained surface rights in the transaction and converted the structure into mixed industrial office space. Properly disclosed. Accurately valued. Leased at market rate with documentation that reflects every structural and legal characteristic of the property, including the PCIG infrastructure below, which I disclosed in every lease agreement as required. It rents for more than Jason's beach house. Lauren and I began couples counseling 2 weeks after the Harborview meeting. I want to be honest about this because these stories have a tendency to resolve cleanly when real life doesn't. We didn't reconcile immediately. We didn't have a single conversation that fixed everything. What we did was begin a longer conversation, the one we had been avoiding for years, about what we each actually valued, and whether those values could coexist in a single life. Some of that conversation was hard. Some of it was harder than the warehouse night. But we read the document of our marriage the way I read any important document, line by line, without skipping the parts that were uncomfortable. We are still in that conversation. That is the honest answer. Underscore. There is something I want to tell you directly before this story ends, because the ending matters as much as the middle. Jason Turner, my brother, is not a villain. He's not a bad person. He is a man who learned, early enough that it became a reflex, that confidence can substitute for competence in most rooms most of the time. He is a man who watched that strategy work for decades and built an identity around it so completely that he lost the ability to distinguish between what he knew and what he felt certain about. A lot of people are Jason. A lot of people are in rooms right now, moving fast, signing things, restructuring things, leveraging things, absolutely certain that their momentum is doing the work that their diligence isn't. And for most of them, for most of the time, they will be fine. Because the gaps only matter when the stakes are high enough for the gaps to be visible. When the stakes are low, speed wins. When the stakes are high, paperwork wins. My father understood this. He built something specifically because he understood which kind of man each of his sons was, and he structured his legacy accordingly. He put the quiet asset beneath the son who would find the quiet asset. He put the visible asset in the hands of the son who needed visibility. And he protected the quiet asset specifically from being sold before the right son understood what it was worth. He read his sons the way I read documents. Carefully, without projecting what he wanted to see. Accurately. That is the inheritance I actually received. Not the warehouse. Not the federal lease. Not the $2.4 million in escrowed payments or the $3.8 million buyout. The inheritance was the example. 40 years of watching a man who moved quietly, read carefully, owned what he built, and never once needed the room to acknowledge what he knew. I am 52 years old. I spent the first half of my life being the quiet one, the stable one, the one who maintained what others built and was called small for it. I am spending the second half of my life understanding that stability is not the absence of ambition. It is the foundation that ambition, when it is real and not performed, requires in order to become something permanent. Lauren said to me once, standing in that amber warehouse light, that she had wanted momentum. I understand that. Momentum is visible. Momentum feels like progress. Momentum gives you something to talk about at dinner parties with crystal glasses and investors who gauge your worth by what you're building rather than what you've protected. But momentum without foundation is speed in a direction you haven't verified. And speed in a direction you haven't verified is how you sign away a $3.8 million federal subcontract because someone used the phrase structural attachments and you didn't ask what it meant. I am not the paperwork guy. I am not the maintenance department. I am not the stable one in contrast to the visionary one. I am the man who reads the attachments. And in the end, the attachments were where everything that mattered actually lived. Underscore. The warehouse still hums on certain mornings when the heat builds against the metal siding and the thermal shift creates pressure against the structure from the outside. On those mornings, if you stand at the west wall near where the steel access plate is still bolted into the floor, you can feel it. The faint vibration of something beneath the surface. Something running. Something that was always running. That never stopped regardless of what was happening above it. That existed entirely independent of how anyone on the surface chose to describe or dismiss or ignore it. My father built that. Not the infrastructure. The PCIG engineers built the infrastructure. My father built the patience around it. He built the legal structure that protected it. He built the documentation that preserved it. He built the silence around it specifically so that it would be found by the son who would understand what it was before deciding what to do with it. I found it. Not because I am smarter than Jason. Not because I am better or more deserving or more worthy of what my father had to leave. But because when I walked into a building that everyone in my life had told me was worthless, I didn't look at the surface and conclude. I read the language. I pressed my palm against the casing and felt what was warm. I pulled the file and found the attachment. I have been thinking lately about the men and women who are in the position I was in 3 months ago. The stable ones. The ones who maintain. The ones who people describe as lacking vision. The ones who have spent careers making other people's momentum possible and been given no credit for the foundation that momentum required. I want to tell you something directly. What you do is not small. What you do is the thing that everything else rests on. The people who move fast and build visible things need someone who read the fine print before they signed it. They need someone who checked the clause, ran the audit, verified the classification, pressed the palm against the casing, and noticed the warmth. They need you. They just don't tell you that, because acknowledging the foundation doesn't generate the same dinner party applause as describing the building. But the building doesn't stand without you. And when the documents finally matter, when the stakes become high enough that speed is no longer sufficient and accuracy is the only currency that counts, you will be the one in the room who read the attachments. That is not a small thing. That is, in the end, the only thing. Underscore. The last time I drove past the port at night, the cranes were lit against a dark sky, enormous and skeletal and specific in the way that industrial infrastructure is specific. Functional. Designed. Built to last rather than to impress. The warehouse was lit from the inside, several of the new tenants working late, light coming through the high windows in the same strips that sunlight came through in the morning. Beneath it, data was moving. Has been moving for 25 years. Will keep moving long after the people arguing over its value have resolved their arguments and moved on to other things. My father sat on a secret worth millions for a quarter century without telling anyone, because he was waiting for the right person to be ready to receive it. He knew the right person would find it when they needed it. He knew because he knew his sons. He knew which one read the attachments. I drove home in the quiet. No music. Just the low hum of freeway tires and the particular satisfaction of a man who has finally, at 52 years old, stopped correcting other people's mistakes and started reading his own documents. Under my feet, beneath the concrete of the city, somewhere in the buried infrastructure of the coast my father worked for 40 years, data runs uninterrupted. Quiet. Permanent. Accurate. Like everything that actually lasts.